Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Noble Company podcast. My name is Roanne Smith, and I am your host for this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about workplace bullying. From the poll that I put out on LinkedIn as well as on my WhatsApp, it seems like most persons believe that workplace bullying is not adequately addressed in the workplace. Whether they think that their boss isn't doing enough, that they themselves don't know how to address it. But clearly, we're seeing a challenge. And as we talk to our guest today, we'll find out that's actually something that's pretty prevalent across the Caribbean. So, to chat with us today about this topic is Professor Dwayne Devonish. He is no stranger to this podcast. He's been on like 3 million times. And so for those who don't know, he's a professor at the University of the West Indies, Cave campus. He is a professor of management, and his specialization is in organizational behavior, organizational psychology, sorry. And he also is an expert in workplace bullying. So we are very happy to have him today to talk about this very important topic. Welcome, Dwayne.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. How are you?
I'm pretty good.
Good.
I had a good vacation, so that has passed. So I'm back
And
to
you know that I am always happy when you get to rest because you are always going, 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 going. So that's great to hear.
for sure.
All right. So I'm going to start with the first question. It might seem obvious to many, but what is bullying?
Okay, so bullying is a broad category of negative or unethical or hostile behaviors that are directed to one or more persons within a particular space. It could be within a school setting, it can be within a family or household environment. But typically, because we're looking at the workplace, it can also be concentrated within a work setting. So these behaviors can vary from verbal abuse, sexual harassment, in fact, is a subset of bullying, but it is not concentrated to sexual harassment. In fact, there are models of or definitions of workplace bullying that excludes what we call discriminatory practices in the workplace. For example, when we talk about discrimination, typically we identify protected characteristics like gender and age and disability status and so on. But anyone can be bullied. It doesn't matter if you fit within a minority classification or protected class. And effectively, you typically have two parties at play: a bully and a target or victim of bullying.
All right, thank you for that. And so I've been reading your work on bullying, and in a recent article that you wrote, you mentioned some types of bullying that I had actually never thought about. Things like isolation and overwork. And on reading that, I'm like, okay, that makes complete sense. But would you share some of the other ways that persons are bullied in the workplace?
Okay, so I think probably the easiest way to kind of classify bullying is uh, using three dimensions. So we have work-related bullying,
Mm-hmm.
which represents a class or category of behaviors, negative behaviors that that undermine the professional standing of an individual in the workplace, or that degrades unfairly someone's work. So, for example, belittling professional opinion, belittling their roles, um, overlooking someone who is worthy of promotion, preventing access to opportunities for growth, for advancement, persistent and unjust criticism,
Mm-hmm.
overloading people with work. In fact, that's a form of bullying. So that's work-related bullying. So if you think about any attacks against a professional or an employment setting within the space in which someone works, reclassified as work-related bullying. But we can also have within the same workplace person-related bullying, and those are really personal attacks, things like slander, attacks of someone's personal life. For example, you may attack someone because of how they look in the workplace. So these are unwarranted criticisms against the person, him or herself. Nothing to do with the work, but it's all to do with the individual. So that's referred to as person-related bullying. And then you have physical intimidation. And physical intimidation is where you use threats, verbal threats, physical threats against someone in the workplace. So this is a lot more aggressive than the other two. And that is where it gets very serious and can be potentially a risk, a significant and conspicuous risk to health and safety. Hi, Ron, I'm
I
not
just
hearing you.
realized I was muted.
Oh, okay.
So tell me something. You mentioned overwork. And I know that
Mhm.
sometimes persons who perform very well in the workplace are often burdened with a whole set of work. Um, but I don't think the intent is bullying. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, we have to look at this in a very surgical way. Bullying is typically something that happens between one party that has power and the next party who is
Yes.
considered to be subject to that power. So typically in the case of a supervisor and a subordinate, and now we know that there are certain situations and circumstances where someone can be overworked at their workplace bullying. But let me give you more work or more workload to an individual who may very well who may very well push back and say, well, I think this is unfair, or this does not agree with my contract, or can I have support? Can I have greater resources? And that supervisor does not renege and continues to give work and more work that places that person under a health and safety risk profile. So it is within I think it's within the environment in which it is being done on an individual, and an individual is pushing back. The individual is saying that, because remember, in many cases, this is a subjective experience, because one may ask for more work and then find him or herself overloaded. But this is a situation where there's a perception of unfairness. Now, that means that a critical feature of workplace bullying is that there is a perception of victimization. In the same way that if you think about how we classify things like racial discrimination, sexual harassment, it is effectively a perceived victimization of um, a perceived interjection of harm from an individual, which that individual then seeks to have some justice or recourse. Yeah, Ro, I think you're muted again. Yeah. Mhm.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that face on camera. No. So from your work, it seems like workplace bullying in the Caribbean is pretty high as compared to many other um, economies. Do you think that that's indicative of what's going on in our wider society? Or where do you think that comes from?
Okay, so just to contextualize the prevalence of workplace bullying from a study that I did in 2014, 2017, the what the study did was to kind of capture a sample, just over 250 workers, to identify their experience with workplace bullying. Now, using a specific methodology, what I did was to itemize different behaviors of workplace bullying that employees perceive that they are receiving. Now, the prevalence rate for workplace bullying was about 50, just over 50%, which is very high when you take into account global standards of prevalence rates of workplace bullying. And I think that was because It wasn't high for all facets of workplace bullying. There were at least two or three. So just to contextualize, that percentage is really for a subset of bullying behaviors. And I can just share what that percentage is actually calling or referring to. Is there were two dimensions of workplace bullying. One, it was the belief that they were being persistently criticized unjustly for their work, and that they were being ignored, or they were victims of hostile reaction, all right, to their work. So it was indicating that there were certain subsets of bullying behaviors that were perceived as pretty high in the Barbadian context. So those two dimensions: frequent and persistent and unwarranted criticism, and of course the experience of being ignored or overlooked in the workplace. Now, many may argue that those kinds of behaviors sound pretty benign, but they're nevertheless classified as bullying behaviors because they do have consequences, whether psychologically or otherwise, yeah, for workers. Yeah, I think you're muted again, Ron. Mhm.
I'm really not good at this. And so, as it relates to the wider society and the implications, like what story do you think that's telling about our wider society, if if there's a
Mhm.
story?
Well, one of the things that I did find about the prevalence of workplace bullying, when the prevalence of workplace bullying is high, especially in certain cultures, because it's not surprisingly, it's being classified pretty high in certain European countries, African countries as well, and there are some commonalities or common threads in those cultures. Uh, Clearly, one, societies that have a cultural disposition to accept bullying behaviors as normal in position or in stance, those cultures typically carry high prevalence. So, for example, if it is within the culture of an organization or society to say that it's okay for someone with a certain degree of power to belittle or to overwork a subordinate, or to be highly competitive to the point that the means justify the ends, you will find in those types of societies, and by extension in workplaces operating those societies, tending to have a higher prevalence of workplace bullying. So I think culture is a major variable in this whole understanding of workplace bullying in the workplace.
All right, so we have a question from Kevin Clark, and I think it's actually a pretty good question because earlier you talked about the power dynamic, but he's asking about bullying amongst employees on the same level. What do you think
Yeah,
about that?
yeah. I mean, the research is quite clear. My research was pretty strong at this point. That obviously, the even though that bullying is much more prevalent in a kind of imbalance of power relationship, in a sense, between a superior and a subordinate, we found what parallel relationships, in the sense where those who are on the same level, that you can have cross bullying. So I mean, in my research, for example, I found that those persons who were bullied were also predisposed to be bullies themselves. Now, in a case like that, you find that, again, this is cultural. So what you've had is that, let's say you go into an organization where certain forms of bullying uh, are allowed or normalized in the culture. And like with any culture, we those cultures are imprinted on us, especially for persons who tend to acclimate to workplace cultures more so than their individual values. So where workplace cultures kind of undermine or overwhelm individual values, people tend to operate in the same way. So if organizations are highly competitive, they're high bullying oriented, individuals tend to kind of behave in the same ways, and you will have those kinds of bullying behaviors among co-workers, especially, and this happens especially when there's scarce resources and there's competition, high competition for those resources, like things like promotions and job opportunities and appointments. Let's say you're in public service and there are only few appointments that can be made, and people get nasty with it, you know. So it does happen.
And even when you talk about employees being on the same level and power, I think about informal types of power. So there's the formal power within organization or legitimate
Correct.
power, but we also have informal leaders in the organization, persons that we might call ring leaders. And
Yeah.
so they wield a certain level of power or influence within the organization as well. And when we talk about things like isolation, those persons have the power to say to others, okay, don't, I mean, it sounds really juvenile, but don't talk to this person, or um, don't share resources with this person
Yeah.
for whatever reason. So I can definitely see that there would be a connection between um, even informal types of power or leadership within the organization and bullying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it goes back to the point with where you see these parallel relationships with co-workers who wield a lot of power, as you said, not formal power over others, but there's this informal power grab that they have, and they leverage that power grab, that power center, by, for example, for malevolent reasons or for malevolent purposes, to get back at people. So people, what we call cliques. So people typically can form cliques in organizations or factions in organizations, and some factions are more powerful than others. And there's this, what we call, there's a theory in psychology, the in-group out-group
Mhm,
perspective, where you create an in-group that you protect as a leader. So that informal leader, galvanizes support in that in-group, but that in-group, that galvanizing of support is at the expense of those who they don't identify with, which would be considered the out group. So
mhm,
the theory behind this is that those who are more likely to be bullied are those who are on the fringe or margins of the workplace setting. So they're
mhm,
not within what we call the traditional power circles. That's
mhm.
absolutely correct.
And again, that's something that's pretty much reflected in society. So it's the persons that are marginalized who are the most disadvantaged or who don't have the access to the resources. So again, within the workplace, it makes complete sense that it would be mirrored.
Mm.
Um, but in your research or in your experience, have you come across any forms of bullying that you would say is more prevalent than others? So, for example, is workplace related more prevalent than um, what do you say, person related, for example?
Yeah, I can categorically say that it is. I've observed work-related bullying, and in fact, my paper actually demonstrated that work-related bullying was more prevalent than person-related bullying. And I think the reason is that if you think about it, person-related bullying is representative of personal attacks to a individual's personal reputation. Those
Mm-hmm.
types of bullying can be legally covered if you think about it, like defamation clearly is a subset of person-related bullying, and that's something that is obviously liable. That can bring liability to the perpetrator or to the organization in which it's happening. So you tend to have what we call more covert or latent, hidden forms of bullying in the format of work-related bullying. So, for example, Ron, I can give you more work, and even though that is a form or subset of bullying, that is still within the instrumentation of your portfolio, because at the end of the day, your contract as my supervisor is to give me work. So I can covertly balloon that work. I can create an environment that's very difficult by overburdening you with work, creating a kind of an unhealthy environment without it kind of turning a kind of an open eye at, and people can get away with that. Another example, I can overlook you for promotion because I can use a pretext, under the pretext that the organization is not going that direction. We don't have enough money, when in fact the organization can easily promote me, but because I have a particular vendetta, or you're my target that I am trying to get at, I use that. I wield the natural instruments of my organizational power to kind of keep you down without it being something overtly or conspicuously aggressive or malevolent. Mm.
Yeah, and the thing is that those things those things start to eat away at a person bit by bit by bit, and it really starts to lower people's confidence, and it starts to manifest all sorts of different consequences of bullying. So
Mhm.
would you share with us what are the different types of consequences of bullying in the workplace, personally and for the organization on a whole?
Yeah. So if you think about it, because bullying is actually classified as a psychosocial hazard, and this is well known internationally as what we call a classification of health and safety risks. So, for example, when we think about health and safety risks, we typically think about physical health hazards. So, for example, poor working furniture, ACs, air conditioning units that are not serviced. Those are what we call physical hazards. But workplace bullying has been classified as a psychosocial, meaning that it has psychological and social consequences. The nature of the bullying. So if we're going to classify the consequences, we have to classify them across those domains. In fact, the research that I found, I was looking at the impact that bullying has had on depression. And that is, there's actually something called work-related depression. And obviously it points to the mood and your emotional pattern. And what we found is that person-related bullying and work-related bullying have all significantly impacted on how how people's emotional state. So people tend to have higher depressive symptoms. We also looked at the impact of bullying on anxiety, which is a subset of mental health, like depression. So people are more anxious. We looked at things like physical exhaustion. Now, this goes out of the psychological realm. So we realized that bullying also carries physical consequences. So things like physical exhaustions, even chronic illnesses over the long term, prolonged bullying, especially taking on those effects psychologically, can have a significant toll on your physical health. So literally developing cardiovascular problems, things like hypertension, musculoskeletal problems and issues, headaches, migraines, which are somatic, which deals with the physical health. And we also realize that there are behavioral consequences. So you'll find that people who are bullied are more likely to be absent from work. So those are behavioral consequences. They're more likely to be late for work. They are more likely to want to leave work, which are turnover intentions, and they're more likely to actually terminate their contract with the organization as soon as an opportunity arises for them to leave. Yeah. So there's a wide range of consequences out there, from physical to behavioral.
What I think is really interesting is that a lot of this managers learn when they're doing their masters, they're like in business or they're doing their MBAs, and it's almost like a lot of people taking this information, they think it is purely theoretical, but there's some kind of disconnect with how it is operationalized in the workplace.
Mhm.
And I am not sure that persons understand the extent to which it really affects performance. And so I'm really glad that you brought up things that like absenteeism and depression, not depression, absenteeism and turnover, because I think those are things that managers can relate to. Well, not all of them, but I think sometimes managers need to understand the impact that it has on the bottom line and how addressing it, whether it be them not addressing their own bullying tactics or not addressing bullying by others in the workplace, can have serious consequences on profitability. So let's take a couple questions. Um,
Yeah.
we have a question from Kevin again. He says, in your research, did you find that there is any prevalence of gender-based bullying? By this, you often hear that it's difficult to have too many women in an environment. Has your research considered this? And again, culture has a role to play as well. Forgive my queries if I'm not following protocol for the evening. Not sure how interactive the session is. The session is very interactive, Kevin. So thank you so much for asking your questions. We appreciate them. Dwayne?
Yeah. So I didn't look specifically at gender-based bullying. However, secondarily, in one of my other research papers, I was looking at workplace health, gender, and a form of bullying. And it actually revealed that there was really no significant difference between the the gender of the target of bullying, in the sense that men and women were actually equally likely to be bullied in the workplace. Um, and this is not surprising in the sense that it also depends on the type of bullying that is encountered. And in many cases that you might find the reverse, that a lot of men may very well be bullied in certain types of organizations relative to women, depending on the type of work being done and of course the kind of organizations that you find yourselves in. For example, a lot of the traditional literature have identified that in traditional male dominated workplaces, especially workplaces where there are very few women, uh, a lot of men who hold certain positions or positions of power or authority, that women tend to be at the butt or the target stream of bullying. But now remember that we have there, especially in the workplace, there are a lot of women in certain workplaces that actually hold positions of power, and we found that women themselves actually can hold back other women in workplaces. And we've seen that in certain professions, like in journalism. This is international research, not really my research, but we've seen this where women who, especially who've made it to the top, almost would kick down the ladder, so to speak, against other women who try to ascend, and they're much more harsh against those women at the what we call the subordinate levels or the junior levels. So there are, yes, circumstances where gender-based bullying comes in. People might argue that it may be gender-based discrimination. So instead of using gender-based bullying, we may use the term gender-based discrimination. But we've seen examples of that, especially in different types of bullying behaviors. Probably given menial tasks, for example, allocating or assigning menial tasks. That's one of the bullying behaviors you would find that's gender-based. Because in a case where you're in an organization, you will find that women tend to take on more of those tasks or be assigned more of those tasks relative to men. Again, this all depends on the type of industry we're in.
Okay, thank you, Dwayne. We have a question from Team Florentville. Welcome. What do you think are some of the factors that contribute to workplace bullying within an organization's culture?
Okay. All right. So that's great. That's a great question. So as I said before, one of the facets of now remember a culture is defined as a set of norms, traditions, uh, practices that occupy or reside in a space, whether it's in a workplace or in a full country. Now, when we talk about organizational culture, we're talking about those set of norms and value systems within a workplace. Now, one, cultures that are more competitive. So these particular cultures that are more competitive are more predisposed to bullying behaviors because of because of the nature of competition. Competition is one where you have certain factions who are pitted against each other, especially in the case of scarce resources. So you're more likely to have high aggression, um, high intimidation, and sometimes even exclusionary tactics. So tactics to kind of exclude or isolate people or ostracize people who are considered to be fringe or marginalized in nature in the workplace.
All right, thank you. And one more question. Well, one more question for now. Uh, Gail says there are good examples, but how would you identify the subtle bullying and what could you do? Sorry, something just popped up on my screen. What could you do about it? Isn't that harder to prove?
Absolutely correct. Because you see, once you have a covert expression of bullying, is very easy to leverage, especially if you can cover it within the natural instruments of your portfolio. Whether you're overlooking someone for promotion, whether you are giving someone more work than they can really handle, those are things that you can pretty much hide within your occupational space. Now, one of the things that I think is important for managers then to do is to define the facets of bullying, and I don't think we do a good job in defining our experiences. So like for example, if I'm going to create a sexual harassment policy, one of the things that should be in place in that policy are clear definitions and what kind of standards that need to be met for something to be defined as sexual harassment. Now, the same thing applies to workplace bullying. If you think about it, in the US, the legislation is still behind when it comes to defining what workplace bullying is and the different manifestations in which workplace bullying can take. Now, if the US is behind, I can tell you the Caribbean, especially Barbados, we are far, far behind because right now the only health and safety legislation that we have in the books that will, I would say, in a large extent covers bullying is the Safety and Health at Work Act, which is the Shaw Act for short, that we call our kind of omnibus piece of legislation to kind of put in the hands the duty of care of employers to ensure that they control any risks to the health and safety. Now, even in that act, there's no clear definition of what bullying is, or even what. And I can be honest, I'm very critical of the act because the act doesn't do very well in kind of identifying the psychosocial hazards outside of bullying. Because there are other psychosocial hazards outside of bullying that can actually create a significant risk to health and safety. The act has been narrowly defined in terms of physical health hazards. So I think what organizations need to do is to create policies now, in the absence or in the silence of any definition of bullying in what we have in our legislative space, that we have to kind of put that in our policies, define what those characteristics are, those behaviors, and to actually append the right gravity of sanctions for the perpetration of those types of behaviors, so that both the subtle and the overt expressions of bullying are covered, at least at the policy level, in the absence of legislative coverage.
I completely agree because I think that there are, actually, I should say what I agree with. I agree about getting very specific
Yeah.
about what the different elements of bullying are because I find that sometimes persons do not, because of their socialization, for example, understand that certain behaviors are inappropriate or certain behaviors are inappropriate at work. And I have worked in places, you talked about sexual harassment before. I remember I worked at a place where a guy told me that I was sexy. And I
Mm.
was like, well, that's not a work appropriate word. And then the next day, he told me something else. And I was like, but that's not work appropriate either. And then he said, so what should I tell you? And I was like, you can tell me that I look beautiful. I think that
Yeah.
that's better. And we take for granted that people know, right? But sometimes, honestly, people, based on their socialization, do not know and they need to be educated. And sometimes when you tell them, you see these bells going off and they're like, oh, okay. And like, so it's actually coming from a genuine place. So it's really
Mhm.
important for us not to take certain things for granted because when you have something that's very general like that, there's a lot of things that can fall into the cracks in between. So yeah, I completely agree with getting really specific and, like you said, um, attaching the different levels of gravity of consequences to suit.
Mhm. Mhm.
All right, and then we have Lisa James. She says, good night. I tend to agree that some women bully subordinates, especially when they see that individual has potential. And I would say, I mean, I don't know if Dwayne wants to talk about that, but I would say yes. I see that happens as well. But I also do think that women get a really bad rap. Um, I think that I've worked with some really supportive women. I have been surrounded by some really supportive women. It's really unfortunate that the women that our bullies are the ones that are highlighted often. I think, though, that one of the challenges with that is that, and I don't think that we look at it in the broader sense of how our society works. You talked about journalism, and I thought about women aging out of the workplace in journalism. There's a big challenge with in North America with women being a certain age on television, and therefore having to try to keep the younger women down in order to keep their place secured in the workplace on TV. And so women are often faced with those situations where they have to try to keep themselves relevant. And so then and I'm not excusing bullying behavior, but then when they start to exhibit certain behaviors, I don't think people look at the wider picture or the circumstance that has brought them there. Person just look at um, the effects. So that's my little 2 cents on that. I don't know if you have anything to add, Dwayne.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, you can kind of blanket it as a statement that, women empowered naturally would be bullies to other women. I think what the research actually suggests is that there are moderating factors or contingency factors behind that, because what they've found, though, that women who have gone through the rigmarole, the hopes, the aggression, the bullying themselves,
Yeah.
when they do reach the top, and we've seen this in the research where persons, and this is irrespective of gender, persons who've been bullied are likely, not always, but likely to be bullied themselves, especially if they survive the experience, and they're still able to ascend to positions of power.
Hmm.
And it's almost like, I mean, it's no different from the arguments we've made where children themselves who've been abused, oftentimes many of those children, not all of them, actually go into adulthood as abusers themselves
Hmm.
in their families and so on. So we got to recognize that the trauma is still something that can be, well, the talk of trauma is something that we still have with this whole concept of workplace bullying. So the same way that we talk about trauma in families and households, that same trauma talk or discussion prevails in the workplace system,
Hmm.
or it repeats itself. Yeah.
True. All right. So we've talked about some of the challenges. So let's start to look at some of the solutions.
Mm.
So let's start with us as individuals. How can we stand up for ourselves and for others in the workplace?
Mm. Mm. Well, I mean, as individuals, I think one of the things that we need to do, to be quite frank, is to be vigilant and to call out persons when they do these things. I mean, I like to draw the parallel within the school environment. If you think about it, I think either in our childhood or in our school environment, we have one either been targets of bullies at school or have witnessed someone being a target of someone's bullying behaviors. And as children, I can remember, you would look and you would say, "Look, I stay away from that. I ain't saying a word." You know, and these things kind of accompany us into adulthood. So we in workplaces and we actually are seeing people being bullied, but we keep to ourselves. So that's not my business, or so on. I think we have to call out persons. There's this cancer culture that I see permeating on social media. Lizzo, we got to cancel her. She's bullying her dancers and her workers, and so on. And I'm not saying that I'm not a fan of cancel culture, but I think the only thing that I can take away from that is that if there is wrongdoing, that we should not be scared to call it out, and say, but that's not right. And I'm not saying for someone to go out of their way to put themselves in trouble, because sometimes you will be pushing back against a major power, especially if it's your own boss as well, and so on. But I think we need to look out for each other in that way. But I think at the other individual level, I think people need to document. Documentation is very important. Journal, keep a record, whether they're emails and so on, just keep them, because the time it will reach a head where someone would ask you, but where's the evidence that I've been bullying you or that person has been bullying you? And you have to be able to show that evidence, because it's all about evidence gathering. So as individuals, those are the things that we can do within the workplace. As organizations, we can do a lot more from the employment, if that's the next question. So from an employer perspective, there's a lot more that they can do. For example, I made mention of the crafting of policies. We need to have explicit policies defining and identifying those behaviors that are considered to be bullying behaviors and taking a zero tolerance approach. The same we take a zero tolerance approach to things like sexual harassment, discrimination, and those types of things. Workplace bullying has to reach the same level of attention and treatment. I think not just having a policy, because it's one thing to have a policy, but it needs to be enforcement. It's very important that when the policy is in place, that then you have to put mechanisms in place to allow for any expression, any existence of that behavior to be investigated. So the mechanism should allow what we call a reporting mechanism, which allows victims, or in this case, alleged victims, to report any experience or any experience with what they classified as bullying. There should be an investigative mechanism which is triggered by the report, because sometimes we have these reporting channels going up, but there's nothing coming down. So you just have a whole set of complaints, and HR or management is just sitting on these complaints. So there's no investigative mechanism. So there needs to be a mechanism to investigate, which it could be through a grievance mechanism, which is typical and routine. And then there needs to be, once there's that investigation, there's this gathering of evidence and so on, and there's a resolution, then the sanction that is agreed with any policy should be enacted. It's like, you're telling a child, don't do this and do this. I will do this. I will punish you in this way. And the child does it and you don't punish it. The child will say, well, you're serious. So we need to also enact those sanctions. I mean, there are obviously special cases where a sanction may be considered to be too severe. So of course you will have those kinds of deliberations that will come into play, but a sanction needs to be enacted once that case is proven to be so. The evidence is in that direction, and we need to act in whatever way. So those are different ways. But don't let me get on the punitive side. Oftentimes bullying can be addressed from a preventative standpoint. Things like accountability systems. You find that bullying tends to occur in situations where accountability systems are low. So when you don't have those accountability systems, a lot of managers and persons in power can do a lot of things without getting those accountability checks. So I think we also got to look at our accountability systems. Things like open communication, making employees feel comfortable in reporting those types of abuses or maltreatment in the organization. And we need to kind of create that culture, that environment. I think training is so important, because let's be frank, there's an article I read which talks about the rehabilitation of the bully. And we spend so much time looking at the victim, which is rightfully so, we should, because things like victim support, counseling, those types of things after the experience are all important. But the bully, in the sense that once the offense is not severe, where the bully's contract is terminated in some way, that bully should undergo some form of rehabilitation, some form of training, and not just wait till the person becomes a bully. I think that training should be at the very start for all incoming employees to kind of acclimate them into the appropriate ways of behaving. So things like emotional intelligence. We found that bullies tend to emerge under a low emotional intelligence profile. So if you have low emotional intelligence, you are more likely to be a bully. So how do you preempt that, or how do you kind of circumnavigate that? Well, you provide training, an ongoing training program on emotional intelligence, on proper communication or proper interpersonal treatment at work. Those are the things that you do to kind of develop a culture as well of proper treatment in the workplace, anti-bullying campaign of sorts. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So interesting. You talked about the anti-bullying campaign. That's something that you may have to consider for the workplace when it's something that you see in schools. And when I was writing the description for this event, one of the things they talked about is, often we kind of relegate bullying to childhood behavior, but the truth is it's something that follows persons into adulthood if it's not adequately dealt with. And so that's where the rehabilitation that you talked about comes in, because otherwise the person is going to perpetuate the behavior over and over again. Like you said, they're going to affect other people, and outside of persons becoming depressed, for example, or being anxious, like you said, there's a propensity for them to also become bullies. And so the cycle also continues. So we really do need to work on rehabilitation as well. All right. So I'm going to the comments. Gail says that's a good point, Roanne Smith. But how will you get leaders to recognize bullying and to solve it? I think that we talked about that just now. Um, Kevin says, I think culture, and specifically Beijing culture, has led men to believe that they can say what they want to women without recourse. So they take that learned behavior into the workplace, not understanding how disrespectful and inappropriate it is. And I would say that from talking to persons across the Caribbean, that it is also an issue across the Caribbean. I guess our cultures are actually very similar. Um, Kirk, thanks so much for joining us. Kirk asks, do you think that in our region, bullying is often intentionally ignored by organizations and or perhaps encouraged when perpetrated by performers? What do you think, Dwayne?
Yeah, actually, either circumstance can exist. So, in the first part of the question, there are many cases where bullying has been intentionally ignored by management, and for many reasons. Especially when I've seen situations where the bully him or herself was a major agent of management, and management had to look at the cost benefit analysis, and it was for them easier to ignore because of what they consider to be the value orientation of the bully or the set of bullies in that workplace, or perhaps the bully was working as an agent of
Yeah.
on management. In the second realm, you've seen many organizations equally who actually encourage the type of bullying, and we've seen research on this where that happens when the bullying is operating for the benefit of for the objective of management. And so that happens in many of the organizations. And typically would tell you, and they would tell you when you complain as an employee, they would tell you in better words that if you can't stand the heat, get out the kitchen. This is how our organization work. We were always like this, and but it is to their benefit that they would retain it.
Mhm.
So it has a political objective.
Okay. All right. And Gail says, but Rowan Smith, if you're sexy. I mean, I am Gail, but still. So she says funny, but still not funny, because some people do not know when or where and how we have not trained them to do better. Training and communication after developing policy can keep people accountable and on the same page. Well, let me ask, could that be a realistic strategy? And I think that's exactly what Dwayne said, that we definitely need to, in addition to having the policy, keep people accountable.
Yeah, and in fact, let me go further. I think by virtue of having a policy, training and communication should naturally ensue. Because one of the things that I find organizations do is create this checklist culture where they would tell you, okay, we have a policy in place, we have this in place, but they don't understand that there's two versions of how a policy works. So you have the creation of a policy, where what we call the formulation of a policy, but then you have the implementation of the policy. So we have these lovely documents sitting on the files or on the desks of many managers, but they are not enacted, they're not implemented. They don't carry the natural companions of training and communication that should be of part and parcel of the policy implementation effort, because people need to know what the policy is. We need to be trained to behave in ways that are in accordance with the policy prescriptions. That's something that we don't do properly, and I think it could very well be could be the cost and the time and the effort that
Mm-hmm.
naturally come. with policy implementation.
All right. So Suzette says we also have to be mindful of misogyny as well. We still have a lot of boys' club behavior. That is quite accurate.
Yeah.
Um, Kevin says, I think after developing the policies, making it mandatory for employees to go through it annually and take a small quiz following reading material, would help to cement the policies.
Yeah.
Thoughts, Dwayne?
Yeah, I like that. I mean, that's not a bad approach. Um, because technically speaking, a policy should, in essence, carry a mandatory feature to it. Because I mean, when you look at sexual harassment policy, you can't have a sexual harassment policy and say, well, I don't want to follow that. But I think the point goes over well that we need to have employees invested in some way in this policy. I would dare say, though, on the other side of things, that we should also find ways to incentivize employees because we can make a structure mandatory for employees, but we know about how legislative behaviors go. It's not always that we can legislate how someone does something. We have to look at the heart of the person, the attitudes of those individuals, and we can only do so through training and also using the right rewards and incentives. So I think organizations should also have incentive systems in place to one, incentivize people to report bullying so they don't feel pressured or they feel that they will get pushed back if they have to whistleblow or if they have to report some form of wrongdoing against them. Incentivize them and also incentivize other people to report wrongdoing or bullying behaviors when they see them expressed in the organization.
Well, speaking of victimization, Gail asks, is it possible to provide psychological safety, especially for the alleged victims, so they're not victimized for reporting bullying? I think you kind of touched on that, but if you
Yeah,
want
that's
to.
yeah, yeah. I think Gail, that's absolutely critical because the whole when I talk about incentives, part of the incentive structure should be granted that or fostering that psychological safety, that there will be no reprisals for you as a person who is going through a bullying experience in reporting that experience to the relevant management authority. So we have to create that kind of safe space that people don't feel that they are in some way conspiring against the organization, especially if that bully is someone who is powerful in the said organization. But this is something that is affecting me, and I need to legitimately report this for my benefit and my well-being.
All right, Gail says this is an interesting conversation because as a training consultant, it is so hard to get leaders to see that training is not only obvious things like customer
Yeah,
service or financial procedures or IT topics. It includes everything else we're talking about tonight and getting them to understand the importance to their human resource assets. Yeah, that is so true. Again, like I mentioned before, persons are often more concerned about the bottom line and they don't think about the softer skills that the human resources need to have in order to produce, in order to keep the organization profitable. I think persons are more concerned with the technical skills. And so that's where you have things like financial procedures or IT. And with customer service, even though that's kind of a soft skill, um, you still have certain technical aspects of that in terms of SOPs and what's not that persons may have to follow. So, yeah, hopefully this podcast share with everybody you know. The hope this podcast helps to shed some light on some of the issues that are happening. Dwayne?
yeah. I mean, I'm on your same page there. I think we need to do a lot more. One of the things I missed out, I think is that is critical to this discussion, is the whole idea of awareness building, not just at the workplace level, but at the national level. We do a lot of awareness building when it comes to things about our health and about how we feel about a particular subject. I think workplace bullying is one of those subjects that should really be properly merchandised and publicized, and it should be something like in the form of seminars and workshops like this forum, that people can get a better kind of exposure to the information about workplace bullying, and it shouldn't just have to be left up to the a single organization, but perhaps to an association, perhaps the Barbados Employers Confederation or SBA. They can come together. I mean, these organizations, trade unions, of course. I think this is so important when it comes to trade unions that they should really have a level of a spotlight on this, a high level of spotlight for this subject at the national level.
We should initiate it, Dwayne.
Right. Well, let's talk about it after. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Do you have any closing comments? Because we're coming up on the hour.
Mhm. Okay, so I think my closing comments would be these. One, workplace bullying can affect anyone. We've seen in the research that it is, yes, there are certain characteristics of targets that are more prone or more at risk, but technically that depends on the makeup of our organization. So you could be a woman, you could be a man, because you could be a man who is on a temporary contract. You find that people who are on temporary contracts, for example, because of the precarious nature of their contracts, they're more likely to be bullied because people know, well, there is an imbalance of power here because I am appointed, I'm a senior manager, you are on contract. There are certain things that I can do to you that I may not be able to do to others. So I think we need to be one, recognize that truth that anybody can be bullied, and that we also, as a result, need to be vigilant. And being vigilant means that we have to be our brothers and sisters keeper, report bullying when we see it. I encourage people, when if they're bullied, to document and to report that bullying behavior. You don't have to suffer in silence. In fact, I didn't even mention this part, and this is my last final statement here, that legislatively, there may very well be scope for certain types of bullying to be covered from a legislative standpoint. We have an anti-discrimination act in Barbados, outside of the fact that we have a sexual harassment act, and there is a health and safety or safety and health at work act that can still be leveraged in having some legislative backing when it comes to getting justice against workplace bullying or the incidents of workplace bullying in workplaces. So I would encourage Barbados to know their legislation in their country, know the sanctions, know how to kind of how to arrange this in a way that it is supportive of them and ensure that they get the justice that they deserve. And I would say that I also encourage employers to also know the law when it comes to workplace bullying. There's no law on workplace bullying per se, but there are indirect pieces of legislation that does in fact cover it. So thank you, Ron. It was indeed a pleasure to be here.
Sure. And we have Dana. She says, I love that you invite the initiation to happen. Thanks, Dana. Gail says, I'm ready to be included in this initiative, guys.
Excellent.
And Kevin is like, be the change you want to see. Whatever part I can play, I am game as well. Thank you so much, guys. It is a really important issue in Barbados. Like Dwayne said, it is 54. I think it was like just over 50%
Yeah.
of the population, based on his research, is affected by workplace bullying, and that in the Caribbean, and that is pretty high when compared to other territories. So there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done on this. So thank you for coming on. Thank you for your participation. I just want to put in a plug for a retreat that's happening on from October 27th to October 29th. It's called It's Time to Recharge, Recharge the Retreat. And it's a weekend of self-nurturing and empowerment for women. So often women underestimate the importance of self-care activities and support amongst ourselves. And so this retreat is about encouraging women to engage in activities that helps them to improve the way that they view self-care and the place that they occupy in the world. So the retreat starts on Friday, October 27th at 5 p.m. It goes to October 29th. It's at the breathtakingly beautiful Naniki Resort in St. Joseph. And it's an all-inclusive weekend of holistic therapies meant to nourish your soul, including a sound bath, gentle yoga, walking, meditation, cleansing, bonfire, the works. It is going to be amazing. It's going to be hosted by Leslie Reese, Dr. Leslie Reese, and she will also have other guests who will be leading some of these sessions. So I invite you to attend. There are only about 16 spaces available. So you want to make sure that you get one of those. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And I look forward to having you next time on the podcast where we have noble conversations on interesting topics in business across the world. Have a very good evening, everybody. Bye.
Bye bye. Take care.